This week on the nonprofit news feed, we've got charitable giving stats, AI surveys, and we get to geek out to all kinds of nonprofit data, which we love, of course. How's it going? Nick Azoulay, digital strategist at Whole Whale, and I'm George Weiner, the chief whaler at Whole Whale.
Hey, George. It's good to see you. It's going great. It is hot, hot, hot here in New York. It hit 103 or something here in Brooklyn yesterday. So, hope for all of our listeners in the Northeast and around the country in those heat waves, you are staying cool. But we're going to keep things nice and cool today because, George, I think we actually have a kind of positive and non depressing episode, which I'm excited to share with our listeners. So, the first story we want to talk about is that TechSoup has dropped its report about the current state of AI adoption in nonprofits. And I think, George, there's a lot of really interesting tidbits to pull out of this. Most notably, 76% of nonprofits lack a formal AI strategy, and relatedly, similar percentages lack AI policies and guardrails in place. However, a lot of organizations, approximately 85.6% of the organizations surveyed are exploring those tools. So it looks like for a lot of organizations, they are beginning to dive in. They understand the benefits, but perhaps are not quite at the formalization of process or policy. George, one thing we did want to pull out was that there seems to be a discrepancy between the organization's size and the adoption of tools. Of course, that has to do with resources, but also money, right? These AI tools, to kind of maximize their benefit, often require subscriptions at various price points. So some nonprofits are concerned about cost as a barrier, even though that number is only 30%. And yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, George, but I think those are some of the top line stats. What stood out to you from this report?
The biggest deltas on that, that 76% that like we don't have a strategy definitely concerns me. You did a whole webinar with Whole Whale and Whole Whale University around AI policy and practice. This is very real now because we're in the BYO AI phase, bring your own AI to work phase, where it is a figure it out and post things. And this is where probably you are at your riskiest with regard to, yes, it did the job fast, but it did it in a way that increased the liability. What does that mean? Well, one of the things that actually we implemented with CauseWriter and our image generation components that like help you create prompts to create great images for your organization is actually we instructed it not to use real people, images of like real people doing volunteer work or serving food for your food pantry or doing things that look like your community impact, but aren't your community impact. Those types of things are incredibly risky with regard to potential brand damaging, reputation damaging stuff with AI. And the thing is, AI is getting pretty good at creating those types of images. So the temptation is there to be like, oh, we didn't take a picture of that event. We'll just AI generate one and throw our logo on it. Pause for a second and realize if your team is running around being like, oh, that's fine, it means you haven't had the types of ethical and practical internal, external use case conversations that you should really be having. And so that 76% not having a strategy also speaks to policy. The other biggest delta, generative AI usage across nonprofit sizes, X difference between small organizations that were interviewed for this survey and large organizations over 1 million. 34% showed generative AI use cases across the nonprofit sizes under 1 million. So 34% for small, 66% for larger organization over $1 million. And so it's this kind of double tax I see on smaller organizations where they're not getting the efficiencies that, frankly, smaller organizations probably need more of. And they're also small. They're working with smaller budgets. So the thing that would actually help them the most is something that they feel is unattainable. And it actually, which is interesting, isn't necessarily the cost. As you mentioned, that is the biggest driver. It's not like a whole bunch of fives. They had a 1 through 5 scale for this, which confused me a little bit, frankly. But it was like a little happy curve between, 3. It was basically a 3, middle of the road. That was our median when you look at all of those things. So that's not the blocker. It was, and it seemed to be training, comprehension, implementation. As always, it's people, process, and product when you're looking at AI. So that small and large difference for like everything from virtual assistant usage, speech recognition tools, marketing automation utilization, chatbot integration for engagement, it was all X different for the small nonprofits that were surveyed and versus the large ones. Over under 1 million was the biggest differentiating factor in the across the board adoption of AI.
Yeah, George, I think that's such a good analysis. And just to pull out a couple of the threads that I made yesterday, your organization cannot afford to not talk about AI. If
Did you
you are
just
not
double
talking,
negative a fact finding? You
yes,
did it.
yes,
You
your
can't
organization,
not do this.
you can't not do this. So, ergo, you must talk about it because guess what? Your employees are using it. They're experimenting with it. It might be deployed in a way that increases your risk in your workflow. If you are an executive, a board member, whoever you are at your organization, it's important to have these conversations. George, here at Whole Whale, when we first began rolling in I think pretty substantively into our workflows, we had like an anonymous Q&A where employees could submit feedback, concerns, ideas for positive ideas for use, potential and negative consequences of use. And we as a company came together and had that frank conversation about what ethical AI use looks like in our workplace. And we developed together collaboratively an AI ethical policy, both an external version as well as a ton of internal documentation. We do a lot of experimentation and innovation here, George. But if you are a nonprofit and you're not talking about this, you are increasing your risk because AI is already being used somewhere. You're increasing your risk and you're missing out on innovation and experimentation and potential efficiencies. And we all know we need more efficiency. So I'm a firm proponent of just having that conversation and deciding what does safe, ethical experimentation of AI look like within our cause space, George. And, not every organization is made different. If you work in immigration, if you work with at-risk youth, right? Your risk analysis for using AI is very different than, let's say, an animal rights organization. And the public as well also has different understandings and expectations around transparency, right? If you're a very environmentally conscious organization, odds are the public may be thinking, hey, what does ethical AI use look like when we know it takes a ton of energy and compute power, right? I think that sometimes gets overblown, but regardless. Whereas if you're working at an immigration nonprofit, how can your constituents and your employees, both internally and externally, be 100% certain that no personally identifiable information is being gobbled up by these LLM tools, right? Your organization needs to have these conversations. It's not avoidable.
Yeah. And the final thank you here to the TechSoup and TAP network for running the survey. I think having these come out on a regular basis because of how quickly things are moving is so helpful to have these sort of benchmarks just to level set. I was mentioning small, large organizations surveyed 550 under 1 million organizations and 771 over $1 million organizations for a total of 1,321 as a part of the cohort that they brought these insights from. So thanks to the TAP network and TechSoup.
Yeah, that's a great sample size, by the way,
Yeah,
especially for our sector. So
yeah,
awesome
that's
work.
excellent.
All right, George, we have some other top level stats to talk about. This one comes from GivingUSA, which has released its annual report about giving trends in the United States. And the top level trend that we want to call out is that US charitable giving grew to 592.5 billion in 2024, setting a record. That is up 6.3% in current dollars and also represents a 3.3% increase when adjusted for inflation. This is the first time in 3 years that giving has outpaced inflation rates, which is phenomenal to see. A lot of this was driven by stock market growth and in growth in personal income. Individual contributions grew to 392.45 billion, which constituted 66% of all giving, and corporate giving reached an all-time high as well at 44.4 billion. They also broke this down by sector and saw that education and public society benefit sectors saw the strongest claims, both which served 13.2% and 19.5% respectively. So, George, these are good numbers. This is reason to be excited. I wonder how much the election had to do with this, but it seems a little bit maybe more robust across the board than just say giving to candidates.
Yeah, I'd say let's not overanalyze this by like talking about some sort of new charitable wave. It's the economy, stupid, as the famous quote goes. Like the stock market was up. A lot of large donors, I think, led this increase, but it's fantastic to just be able to say the word increase, even with the downward effects of inflation. And so, just seeing number go up finally for charitable giving at 592.5, don't forget $0.5 billion is great. We also saw increases, we were talking earlier in the year with, the giving blocks stats on the increases in crypto giving, which is a lot. And I actually don't know if that's included inside of here, but that individual giving is where I think we're going to be seeing the growth in the coming year. You mentioned for individual donors remain the primary engine at 66%. And I think that's going to continue to be true. I'm a little worried about the fact that like corporate giving reached an all-time high last year. I don't know if that will continue this year. I'm willing to bet that it will not. And so to get that sort of that next marginal dollar, I'd be betting on that, the classic donor pool for diversification. And it's like, if I'm looking at all of those pie charts, in donors and individual donors and then large donors, I trust. I am hopeful for philanthropy. I am suspicious of corporations, and for government, folks that are being supported there, which is not part of like I think the stats on charitable giving, but we have seen government cuts. Unfortunately, right now, incredibly pessimistic for if you're shopping around for these sources of revenue.
Yeah, George, I think that's a good holistic analysis. And then that kind of tees up our next story, which we don't need to spend a ton of time on because we talked about it, but just more reporting from the New York Times about the existential funding threat faced by food banks across the country. So the massive federal funding reductions are hitting food banks nationally at the same time, really. The administration's cuts include $295 billion from SNAP over the next decade, and then the elimination of $1 billion in local food purchase grants, slashing the emergency food assistance program, and demand is surging. New York City pantry visits have increased 85% since 2019, with nearly 3 million New Yorkers facing food insecurity. So the numbers are going the wrong way here, and just kind of sounding the alarm on this. And on the ground organizations are aware of this, but I think it's important for the whole sector to kind of be aware that acute food insecurity is now a thing that our government deems unimportant. So nonprofits are going to be on the front lines of that.
Yeah, I don't have much to add there. It's like the food pantry visits to New York have increased 85%, according to this, since 2019. That exceeds all other measures. Like that's like a Fortune 100 stock rising, but in a bad way. And we're seeing that emergency food assistance is now being expected to become primary food assistance. And those are two very systematic things and with less resources. And, you will hopefully it is something that brings food insecurity to a higher tone and tenor, because if you have millions of people going hungry, you're going to see the reverberations of that throughout communities in a very real way that will hopefully bring back the attention to where, a thoughtful, caring, modern society should be in terms of feeding its people first. And like, can't we take care of Maslow too, of this like first basic need of food and shelter?
Yeah, George, I agree. Just as a very quick aside, this is the morning after the New York Democratic primary for mayor here in the city. And while we're talking about food in New York City, candidate now, presumptive Democratic nominee Zohran Mamdani, after Cuomo conceded basically last night, key pillar of his proposal is some government run, city run supermarkets as essentially a public option for supermarkets. And, George, you go onto Twitter, the amount of people that are apoplectic about socialism, destroying this city. And I'm like, listen, do you know how much money already goes in? Federal, local, state money goes into feeding New Yorkers. This is an all hands on deck effort. George, 1 in 4 kids in New York City live in poverty. So, quite frankly, I don't want to hear it about, complaints about whatever proposals there are, because the fact is that kids in New York are going hungry, and that's unacceptable. So, any and all ideas need to be on the table while our federal government does everything to exacerbate the problem.
Yeah,
End
somehow
of rant.
it's okay to bail out banks, but not the food banks. Okay, let's just keep the scoreboard real clear.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, George, we need a feel good, super duper quick. This comes from WSHU Public Radio, and it is about a Connecticut nonprofit tackling oyster shell waste. George, they're taking
Did you
your
say
old
oyster? It's oyster?
oyster. That's what
I'm a
happens when
big
I go
fan.
too
I just want to
fast.
make sure it's right. I was really excited to see this
Oyster,
story.
oyster shells. They're taking the oyster shells from eaten oysters that are no longer oysters, and putting them back in the ocean so new oyster habitats can be created. And they have recycled over 700,000 pounds of shells over the past 2 years. And George, it actually goes through this lengthy sanitization process that can take up to 6 months. But they're replacing them in the Long Island Sound in order to restore natural oyster habitats. Long live the oysters. And George, speaking of shellfish, I have a joke for you. George, what did the snail running a Get Out the Vote campaign tell their supporters?
No,
It's time to escargot to the polls.
pretty bad. Fun oyster fact: a single adult oyster is capable of filtering up to 50 gallons of water a day. So
Wow.
I also like it because as you put them back into whatever estuary, they're also, the little janitors of the place.
Love it. Love it. Go, oysters, go.
All right, Nick, I think we have done enough here. I'll see you next time.
See you later, George.